Increasing resilience to the SARS-CoV-2 virus and other health threats in food insecure communities was written against the background of the COVID pandemic. Before this, the health of the majority of South Africa's population was already seriously threatened by hunger and micronutrient deficiency, and this had worsened since COVID. Impaired immune response is a real threat, and this was further highlighted by the recent pandemic. So our objectives for writing this was to share knowledge regarding traditional food processing practices and their benefits, and specifically the underlying biochemical processes for optimizing nutrition and health in affordable, accessible ways. Our methods was a review of literature to determine how the nutrition of affordable starchy staples is optimized in traditional diets. The findings were that in developing countries where intake of plant-based food staples are high, the diet is richly supplied in nutrients, both macronutrients and micronutrients, and yet micronutrient deficiency is so common. And the context is there's a low bioavailability of the micronutrients if the context is high plant-based food intake, which also has high anti-nutrient factor levels, and if the diet also is low in animal-based foods, specifically the meat, fish, and chicken foods. Particularly when pulses and whole grains are a big part of the diet, as opposed to tubers and roots, as these plant-based foods have particularly high levels of anti-nutrient factors. And this is because these are they're very nutrient dense. So when a plant-based food is nutrient dense, it develops secondary metabolites. As we heard in one of the opening presentations yesterday, we've got the secondary metabolites that the plant produces to protect itself from predators, and that would be mammalian herbivory, but also other predators such as viruses, bacteria, and fungi. And the higher the nutrient content, the higher the secondary metabolites, which means if a diet contains a lot of pulse and whole grain intake, we also get high levels of anti-nutrients which have established adverse effects on health and nutrition, such as impaired nutrient bioavailability, very relevant in the context of a pandemic, when the micronutrients such as zinc and copper are very important for immune activation. And other adverse effects can be gastrointestinal discomfort, increased intestinal permeability, and toxicity at high levels. However, these anti-nutrient factors also have established crucial protective functions, particularly in a pandemic when some of the anti-nutrients, you've got different categories of them, but some of the classes are effective in assisting immune activation for overcoming bacterial, viral, and fungal pathogens. And others have got antioxidant action, protection from cell and DNA damage, and they have benefits for glucose and lipid metabolism. And those last three particularly relevant with the NCD burden, diabetes, and conditions like diabetes and cancer. So there is seemingly a double-edged sword. How do we benefit from these crucial protective functions and yet protect human nutrition from the adverse effects? Ways to moderate anti-nutrients adverse effects yet reap their benefits seems to challenge developing countries today, but it wasn't always like this. Before industrialization and modern marketing and global marketing practices displaced traditional foods and food cultures, this was not so. And traditional food cultures had various techniques and methods to overcome or to deal with this dichotomy. And our findings were that effective age-old techniques in traditional food cultures existed, simple ones such as soaking, boiling, and fermenting, and these reduced the anti-nutrient factor levels in starchy staples to optimal amounts and improved nutrient bioavailability and allowed protection from the protective functions of the anti-nutrient factors or the secondary metabolites. And this is especially important with the nutritious traditional whole grains and pulses. And for Africa, a traditional whole grain examples are sorghum and millet and maize. Mesoamerica would also be maize. And then for whichever region, whatever dried peas, beans, or lentils, the pulse foods for the region. So the underlying mechanisms of action of these simple methods show the heavy lifting that they can do in overcoming the excessive levels and allowing the benefits to be reaped. Soaking does a lot of heavy lifting. Just by soaking, the excess levels of anti-nutrient factors are leached into the soak water. And as long as the soak water is discarded before cooking and clean fresh water is used, then the levels of anti-nutrient factors that remain can act as protective and they don't disrupt health and metabolism. Other benefits of soaking are dissolving the insoluble mineral anti-nutrient factor complexes. Zinc is bound to phytic acid, for example, and makes it unavailable. Very important when we have a viral pandemic. This is dissolved, and then there's other methods like fermentation and boiling, which deactivates lectins. Lectins can seriously disrupt the digestive system, but they are also important for activating the immune system. So, as you can see with those simple methods, the benefits of traditional food cultures and food processing techniques are that both macronutrient and micronutrient bioavailability is increased, as not only are micronutrients liberated by these processes, but the amino acids are made more digestible and available, and so are the carbohydrates. And food safety is enhanced by fermentation. For instance, the pH drops, and this creates greater food safety, and the levels that remain can be used to provide the protective functions for health. So these methods may not be used everywhere today in the modern world and may have been completely forgotten in certain areas, but they definitely still exist. And such practices are still intrinsic in indigenous communities in Africa, in the developing world, for the conferment of preferred characteristics such as particular taste and sensations. And they also have survived in places in the modern world, in the industrialized world and in developed countries, but not to a large extent at all. The methods that were covered are economically and socially feasible and sustainable, and could in part alleviate malnutrition in affordable and accessible ways, and particularly if traditional whole grains are used. Sorghum and millet for Africa is a grain that's not water hungry, as opposed to other grains that might have been brought from other regions which use a lot more water, and they're also highly nutritious. Understanding these benefits would make community uptake more likely by food insecure households. And in indigenous communities, it is particularly the women who carry this knowledge. And so a strategy for transferring the knowledge of these practices and benefits could be to co-opt community mobilizers who are cognizant of these indigenous knowledge systems to transfer the knowledge into food insecure households or food insecure neighborhoods where they are no longer used. It doesn't have to be the woman, it could be anybody who has a knowledge of these methods and has a flair and a passion for transferring the knowledge.
Sorry, Karen, I'm here about time.
Thank you. So I am finished, and I just wanted to show the yin and the yang of the anti-nutrients, and you can see we have all the various categories with their various adverse effects, but also their corresponding benefits. And if we can just harness the benefits and mitigate the adverse effects via affordable and accessible traditional home processing techniques. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen, for that lovely presentation about the importance of the old in the now. It's really enjoyable. Next up, we have Kwanyana, who's going to be talking about a scoping review protocol exploring the relationship between food insecurity, mental health, and diet intake among adolescents around the globe, across the globe. So over to the next presenter.
Karen, can I ask
Karen, if you could stop sharing your slides so that the next presenter can share their slides, please. Thank you.